Okay, the title for this lecture is What's for Dinner, and that's going to seem a little random until we get a little bit into this lecture, but I promise it will make sense at some point. The topic we're going to handle, first of all, is this question. Where do women's economic roles, that is, household and care, come from? And specifically, what are the biological or cultural explanations that help us to answer this question? So, biologically speaking, the bias or the basis for women's economic roles comes back down to our early studies of hunter-gatherer communities. Hunter-gatherers are the types of groups and the economies that humans practiced for over 90% of our time here on Earth. Amongst these communities, we see a pretty strict division of labor. You might have heard of terms such as man the hunter. Well, there's also woman the gatherer that goes with that. Famous conference back in the 1970s, actually. These types of groups, you can imagine men are out roaming the landscape, hunting wild animals, whereas women are staying home. They have to gather plants nearby. They're also responsible for, taking care of the children, so they can't really be straying too far from the house. They have to breastfeed to take care of the children. If they're menstruating at all, then it's probably would not be great to walk around the landscape. At least these were the sorts of assumptions that these ideas were based on back in the 60s and 70s. The question I ask you then is, why do women's roles as mothers prevent them from leaving the immediate household? You can see so many examples here on this slide of the ingenious ways women have come up with to just strap their babies on their backs and go about their business because they've got stuff to do. They've got places to be, so kids can come along with them. That's not really what's coming down to being this biological factor that was drilled into us early on. How we got it wrong then? Well, we're looking at ethnographic evidence, and what this does is it allows us to learn about the past through the present. So we went out, we observed in certain cultures, but clearly not enough cultures or not the right sorts of cultures to observe everything we needed to see amongst hunter-gatherer communities. What we do see are cooperative childcare practices, younger siblings who are helping to take care of their younger siblings. Elderly women in the community are probably watching after the young kids while women are out gathering the resources that they need, sometimes even hunting, participating in hunts and finding animals on their own. Women in these cultures, they are quite mobile and they have a great knowledge of the landscape. Amongst modern hunter-gatherer groups, there are actually new studies that are even showing that women are equal participants in hunter-gatherer economies. People in these communities tend to have overlapping gender roles rather than strict division of labor that we traditionally had observed or had interpreted from ethnographic evidence. One group in particular, the Aita in the Philippines, the women there, they hunt. They also gather resources such as honey. There is some division of labor between men and women, but overall, men and women are contributing a similar number of calories. The practice for the Aita is monogamy. That's the norm, and men are active participants in childcare. So clearly we got something very wrong early on. There are modern hunter-gatherer groups in which women choose to gather near their home and men hunt across the landscape, but we've also seen the opposite to be true. From that perspective then, did we choose to get it wrong on purpose? And the reason I raise this issue is, it's been argued that going against this sort of stereotype that we expect would have been harmful to the narrative that supported the sort of cultural practices we saw in Western societies in the 1950s, this sort of economic arrangements in which women are economically dependent on men for not only biological, reproductive needs, evolutionary basis, but just for money and support, financial support in general. Man feeds woman, woman propagates men's genes. This comes down to, males having power over women and expecting women's fidelity in response to the sort of support they provide for them. Because of this, women were forced to stay home and they remain dependent on men. And this is a major power issue, something that we'll keep coming back to throughout the semester. That then is what brings us to the cultural basis for gender division of household labor, and your textbooks gets into a few of these ideas as well, so you can go and refer back there for more information. The two sorts of ideas I wanted to talk to you about are what you see here. So the time availability perspective is the first. The basic thesis of this is that women spend less time in the paid workforce, so they have more time for housework, obviously. Studies of this tend to find that women's hours of employment rise, women's household labor does increase, but men aren't actually doing more. In-house labor is actually just reduced, so you're seeing a lowering of standards or outsourcing, bringing in a maid, bringing in a nanny to help take care of the kids. You're able to do this. In these sort of situations, employed women still end up doing more housework than their male partners. Another explanation for this, then, on the cultural side, is what's called the relative resources perspective. And in this case, the division of household labor reflects the economic power of men and women. So whoever has more resources, which tends to be men, avoids doing more housework. Whoever has less resources, which tends to be women, is expected to make up for their smaller monetary contribution. Some studies have shown that the smaller the income gap, the smaller the gender household labor gap. But there's also other studies that have shown that the monetary contribution actually has no effect on the distribution of housework across the genders. So when it comes back down to this sort of cultural basis for these roles, well, it's that gendered perspective on household labor. It comes down to, again, the sort of topics we talked about in the last module, this enculturation that we give to our children early on. We give them certain sorts of toys. You give a girl a kitchen set to play with, and a young boy gets his tool set to play with so he can emulate his father. This sort of symbolic representation of how gender roles are expected to play out. This is reinforced in childhood through sorts of socialization practices, and that's where things are going to change if they're ever going to change. All right, this brings me to subsistence practices, and hence the reason for the title of this lecture, Honey, What's for Dinner? Subsistence practices are how we support ourselves. So how do we live? How do we eat? How do we get our money to do all the sorts of things we like to do? How do we support ourselves? And the practices we engage in to do that can vary from hunting and gathering, horticulture, agriculture, to more specific wage labor or socialist societies. So in a nutshell, that comes down to 4 general types of economies that we can observe. The first is a hunter-gatherer economy. And these are societies in which all food is obtained by foraging or collecting of wild plants and resources. Also the hunting of wild animals, so they are constantly moving around the landscape, seeking out these resources. The second is what we call a subsistence or traditional economy. And these are people who rely on natural resources to provide their basic needs. They go out and they hunt or gather. They also participate, though, in subsistence agriculture. This can take the form of horticulture, growing your own crops, but also herding animals, using secondary products to feed yourselves. In these societies, they try and get a little bit of a surplus, so it's making a little bit more than what you actually need to support your family on a daily basis. And you can use that in trade for other basic goods. We don't see any sorts of industrialization amongst these societies. That comes later on with market economies. So market economies are what we live in. It's what we're used to. It's our capitalist society of Western cultures today. In these societies, decisions regarding investment, production, and distribution, these are all created by the forces of supply and demand. There is tons of surplus. That's how you make your money. You make surplus, you sell your goods, you get the money you need to buy what you want. And we do see very strong industrialization going on. The fourth general economic type is planned economy or socialism. And in these cases, the government controls and regulates all production, distribution, and prices. We're not going to focus too much on that example today. We're going to focus more on the first 3 that you see listed here. So let's start with hunter-gatherer economies. As I said, these are small mobile groups. They exploit a variety of resources distributed around the landscape. rather than depending very heavily on a few or planting themselves in one place to grow crops for their use. These people are highly adapted to the locations and the conditions in which they live. And they typically have these migrational seasons. They go around to different resource areas based on the availability throughout the season. So in the winter months, you want to be in one area because there's going to be a lot of piñon nuts for you to collect. And other times, you want to be elsewhere where the big game is that you can do your hunting. They don't really have these permanent settlements as we imagine them. Because of their high mobility, they don't have a lot of portable their material culture is very portable. So we see short-term occupations, and because they're constantly moving. And so because of that, we'll see them practicing greater birth spacing. So basically, you don't want to have to be moving around with a baby until your first child is already up and walking and can move themselves from one place to another. Otherwise, you're going to be bogged down carrying 2 or 3 kids, and that's not going to be great. In these societies, we do tend to see this gender division of labor. The hunters are usually men. They're the ones going out looking for big game. But you can imagine there's several days where you're going to go out looking on the savannah for a large animal to take down, and you just don't come across anything that day. Or you fight tooth and nail to get something, to kill something and bring it home, and it just doesn't work out that day. So they actually don't end up providing a very large portion of total calories on a daily basis. Gatherers, on the other hand, which do tend to be women, they can be going out collecting plants, other sorts of seeds, fruits, nuts for a majority of the calories. 70 to 80% of the calories in these communities come from those gathered resources. In that sense, I actually think we should call these more gatherer-hunter communities, putting the emphasis where it belongs in terms of the caloric intake of these people. In existing hunting and gathering cultures, women usually do most of the gathering while men specialize in hunting. This is recognized as a division of labor. Other than this kind of gender specialization, and it's by no means universally practiced, there's little specialization of roles within a hunter-gatherer group. So no one really has the ability to accumulate a lot of wealth over others. It's just sort of we call these egalitarian societies. No one else is really elevated above anybody else. These groups are rather small, no more than 250 people, and because of that, sometimes we refer to them as bands. Their diet tends to be quite diverse because they're always moving, they're always going after what's around, and they actually have quite a bit of leisure time because of that, because they know exactly where to go to get what they need. They get what they need for the day, and then they're done. They have the rest of the day off. They're not constantly working, constantly getting rid of pests in their gardens or in their crops, these sorts of things. The last thing to touch on is they have certain sorts of marriage rules that require them to marry outside of their immediate group. This obviously is good for biological reasons, but it also helps in a few other ways. This can foster relationships with your neighbors during difficult times. So if your normal resource areas are really poor that year, maybe you can move into another group's territory in order to help yourselves get by. Intermarriage can also help to negate the possibility of intergroup hostilities. So if you know your sister's living in that community next to yours, they do something to piss you off, well, you're not going to go attack them because you don't want to, put your sister in danger. These sorts of things. Then the Neolithic Revolution came along. And so what the Neolithic Revolution is a gradual change towards the adoption of horticulture, tending to plants, kind of encouraging their growth, and then a full switch over to full-time agriculture. And with this, the gender division changes. Women were the major producers of grains, cereals, vegetable crops, because this was more compatible with child rearing. Men, on the other hand, were supplementing the diet by hunting, fishing, were also using their labor to clear fields, clear large areas of forest and other sort of brush so that more crops could be grown nearby. Amongst this time in our history, we see matrilineal and patrilineal descent, and those are Different ways we recognize family membership based on either through the mom's side or the father's side. In matrilineal societies, there are high degrees of female solidarity, female economic control, whereas in the patrilineal side, that's more male solidarity. Males are in charge of the economy. And with this, we also see increasing population pressure, the need for defense. In these societies, women become what would be considered second-class citizens. With the shift to patrilineal systems, this actually causes men to be able to be the beneficiaries of women's labor. They are the ones who can reap the benefits of women going out, maintaining the crops, keeping that sort of baseline caloric availability there. All right, let's change over to subsistence economies. These are people who are still dependent on hunting and gathering, but they also practice subsistence agriculture. So as I said, this is growing your own crops for your household needs or herding other sorts of animals. The map here on the bottom is showing you the distribution of different types of traditional subsistence economies. So where we see nomadic herders, those people who are shifting to cultivation, or those who are very sedentary, so living in the same place and are practicing intensive agriculture. Another term for these sorts of societies, these are very dependent on what are called smallholder farmers. Smallholders are the drivers of many economies in Africa and especially Southeast Asia. They own a small plot of land themselves and are able to grow their subsistence crops, and maybe even 1 to 2 cash crops, depending on the labor force they have within their family or their community. But continuing the practice of smallholding is getting much more difficult with time. More and more family members, men in particular, are moving to cities to try and get higher paying jobs to help support their families. Other large-scale farming is taking over, buying up lands or maybe causing runoff issues, groundwater, all these sorts of things that you need to have a successful farm. They're drawing those resources away. And also the introduction of industrialized fertilizer and seeds has created this sort of debt cycle. You have to go somewhere to buy a more expensive seed that could do better in drought conditions, let's say, then you're owing more money back and have to sell more crops. It's just a perpetual cycle in that regard. The sorts of roles that we see women participating in subsistence economies are primarily these first 4 that you see listed here, although it also includes, childcare, elder care, cooking, laundry, all the other sorts of things that go with maintaining a house. When it comes to fuel gathering in particular, or fuel making, this is a very intensive labor process, and it involves having to create these sort of charcoal briquettes that can take 7 to 8 hours, or you're drying dung, which you can see in the bottom photo here, laying it out, creating these sort of quick starters for fires. When it comes to water gathering, this is obviously essential for family. This is the water the family needs every day to drink, to cook their food, to wash, all the things you could think of. To do this, women and their children walk 3.7 miles on average to the closest water source. They're carrying these very heavy loads back with them, which can sometimes damage their spines. While women are the ones who make most of the household water and sanitation decisions, what we actually see is that they're rarely involved in the planning or management of water and sanitation systems, which doesn't make any sense. If they're the ones who know what's actually needed and when and how or why aren't they the ones that are involved in planning these systems? When women's land rights aren't recognized, this tends to cause greater issues to access for water. You might have to go around some other property or some other obstruction in your way based on no longer being able to take the quickest route to get to your water and back. For women and girls in sub-Saharan Africa, they end up spending about 200 million hours per day across the country collecting water, which is 40 billion hours per year. So you can see how much school they might end up missing if they're having to spend even more time going further to get water. access to clean water and living in poverty are related to changing the access to water. So if we can make water more easily accessible, education improves, there's less hunger, people's health improves, and there's less poverty. And the people that this will influence the most are these young girls. If they're not the ones having to go out, spend most of their day collecting water, they can go to school, they can play, they can engage in other social activities that help them to develop. In this graphic, what we're taking a look at are the percentages of women who are participating in smallholder or subsistence farming. Women farmers in general across the world's population only make up 8% versus 11%, which are male farmers. But among women in Latin America, 20% of the agricultural labor force, is made up of women. And when it comes to East Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, we're talking about 50% of the labor force is made up of women. Despite that, only 10 to 20% of the landholders are women. So even though women are the ones who are out there working, they're not the ones that own the land. They don't reap as much of a benefit, much of the profit from the sort of fruits of their labor, if you will. And because of that, they're not involved in any sort of policy or agricultural decision making, which again is a huge gap in what should actually be happening. Beyond that, it also creates these sort of debt cycles, education lacking cycles, because you're having to work more. You aren't being able to. It's widening this education gap. So lower yields tend to then pull girls, boys, everyone back home out of school. Maybe you can only afford to send one kid to school to begin with, and you're going to choose your son over your daughter. These are the sorts of patterns we're experiencing. If given equal resources, the picture could look a lot different. If you read through this graphic carefully, you see that even just there's a small little change of 2.5 to 4% change in the equal access across the genders is improving the levels of undernourishment in the world by 12 to 17%. We're reducing that sort of hunger worldwide. Subsistence economies also include women who participate in craft production. Micro-lending sorts of organizations have really started to enhance this practice. Women try and have their own small businesses by making little crafts on the side, selling those in the marketplaces, selling them to tourists. And there are 8 organizations in particular that have started to give microloans to these women to help them buy a sewing machine, for example, or a cow that would then allow them to create the sort of products, goods to sell on the market that will support themselves. Okay, finally this brings us to the market or capitalist societies, which is what we're most familiar with here in the States. I won't get into too many details, we're just going to focus on a few things since it's what we're already most familiar with. But the economic roles of women in industrial societies have tended in the past to be that they were playing more of a subordinate role to men. They're the secretaries, they're of these, ad execs, as you've seen depicted in the show Mad Men. Women who did work were single, usually looking to get married and then quit their jobs. They could go home and have babies. Those women who did work had to meet certain sorts of requirements. What you can see listed there on the right are actually the requirements to become a flight attendant at some point in our history. Women were moving into the workplace were also restricted in the sorts of education they were able to obtain, and so that already put them in a subordinate position because of that. Now, we talked a bit about second and third wave feminism a few weeks ago, and the video on the wage gap that I'm going to have you watch during this week gets into a lot more of the details of this. But gender wage gap, in essence, is that women receive less pay for their work than men. And because of that, women's economic power is diminished. So when you watch the video, you'll see examples and figures like what we see in the graph here of the lower amounts that women are paid compared to men across these different categories of people. So even though women's roles have changed over time, we've become more present in the workforce, the ability of men to maintain that economic power and control has not necessarily diminished or has not become equalized, let's say. There are 4 main reasons that I want to touch on, and the video and your textbook actually touch on some of these same issues. The first being that women tend to hold lower paying, female-oriented jobs. So when you look at the graph here on the right, you see these are the jobs where women constitute a majority. At the top, we see registered nurses. Over 90% of that workforce is female. Going down that list, elementary and middle school teachers, social workers, event planners, managers, counselors, human resources. These are the sorts of jobs where we see a majority of women practicing. When you look at the graph on the left then, what's at the very bottom? Education and health services. These are the sorts of jobs, that's where a lot of the majority of the things you're seeing on the right, those jobs will fall into that lowest area, the lowest impact in terms of economic value and the amount of money women are able to make in these positions. Second, there are the family responsibilities. A lot of women end up going into part-time work because daycare is extremely expensive. I'm not sure how many parents we have in the class. I myself am not one yet, but it terrifies me to think about how much money it's going to cost me to eventually pay for childcare. In this regard, it tends to be the decision comes down to the mom staying home rather than the dad, because, I mean, if you have to be there to breastfeed and biologically, again, have to be around them, then it makes more sense for you to be the one to stay home and the husband to continue working. I'm not saying this is right, I'm just saying this is the patterns we tend to observe. Our maternity leave policies also do not help in this case. We can see in the table here, there are some countries out there that have pretty great policies in terms of maternity leave, 100% pay in the top 3. Several different numbers in terms of the number of weeks that you're able to keep off at that sort of pay in the United States, and only in firms or organizations that have more than 50 people, so not small businesses, you're required to get 12 weeks maternity leave, but those 12 weeks are unpaid. So, relatively speaking, not a great situation here in the States, even though, we're supposedly one of the most industrialized countries in the world. Thirdly, women lack experience or training for better paying jobs, which comes down to their education. So this graphic is showing us the highest paid jobs you can achieve without a bachelor's degree. And I've highlighted a few of them here that tend to be predominantly women: dental hygienists, sonographers, as well as other sorts of medical field testing jobs. These are things you can go into, but again, childcare, cleaning, elder care, administrative work, you don't necessarily need a bachelor's degree to achieve these things, but they're not going to even be that highly paid. The last contributing factor to the gender wage gap then is just straight up gender discrimination. There are lots of contributing factors that create what we call glass ceilings. These are the barriers that prevent qualified women from advancing upward into management positions. And an even harsher reality of that is what's called the concrete ceiling. And this comes back to the intersectionality topic we talked about a few weeks ago. So the dual burden of both racism and sexism in organizations makes it even harder for women of color or women, disabled women, let's say, who have multiple factors going against them in terms of discriminatory practices. So what common themes do we see across all of these types of economies? Well, the shift work is unevenly split. Your textbook talks a bit about what we call the first shift, so the work day. What do you go out and pay? What do you get paid to do? What's your primary income source? Your second shift then is what happens at home: childcare, household labor, and majority of the time these sorts of responsibilities tend to fall on women, even if they are maintaining a job outside the home as well. Finally, there's also what's called the third shift, and this is the emotional work of training children for life in a modernized society. So, doing this, also supporting elderly parents, let's say. We talk about sandwich generations, people who get stuck with having young kids at home, but also having to deal with elderly parents. It's not great. It creates time becomes really the most important commodity, and it's very highly valued. What we saw with the activity for this week, hopefully, is that household tasks, these things are meant to be interchangeable amongst the sexes, shouldn't really come down to one or the other, but women still tend to be the ones who are taking on more of the second and third shift tasks. Another common trend we see is that women's work is not always equally valued. There's two sort of ways we can value work. So the use value of work, these are products that we make, services that are rendered within a family in particular, and so they're not really sold for a profit necessarily. There's no monetary value associated with these. They only have value within the domestic settings. So having clean laundry every day is quite nice and very highly valued, but there's no money involved in that. Exchange value, on the other hand, that's when you produce specific commodities, you engage in service activities in which you get paid. You'd exchanged money for engaging in those activities with someone else. Hopefully it's clear how, based on productive labor and the other types of work that we looked at in the first lecture and in the activity for this week, a major issue we will continue returning to throughout the semester is this last bit here. So the more women are separated from their means of production, so the resources and tools they need to survive, what they need to get by on a daily basis, the more they're separated from that leads to that sort of power imbalance between the sexes, which can lead to all sorts of other issues. And we will touch on some of those in other later sections of this semester.